How could you even say that? I've never heard that in my, I'm just kidding. We always start with something weird like that so that those people who are watching have no idea what came before. But there was something that came before, but not much. And so if you end up watching these quite a bit, you'll see me sort of pacing back and forth, and hopefully you'll be able to hear them extremely well. And as the year goes on, I hope also my clothing is less reminiscent of a high quality. Okay, I just want to say a couple things about the schedule to make sure that we're firm on this. Is anybody new in the class today, by the way? I can scare everybody away on the first day. That's this. I'm getting bad. This is how you know you're losing your edge as a professor. When people start to think you're nice and start taking your class. Though I will say, I have a charisma to me. I'm enthusiastic. I love teaching. I'm not a professor who's awkward in front of students. I like being with you all. I had a career before I was a professor. I was a teacher. So I like students even more than perhaps you would think. And I've also been a coach for most of my life, a CrossFit coach. And recently coached my wife when she went to the World Championships of High Rocks in Nice, France this summer. I wrote her program with her and traveled with her there. That's it. Remember what this course is about. It is a literature course. So you are expected to come and to participate for 5% of your course. Make sure that your phones are silent so that I do not bring it up here and look at it and make that part of the day's theater, maybe even record it. Who is Brad who's saying this? Internet? No, I would never do that. But you know, it's good to sometimes say things that might not happen. In any case, remember that the vast majority of this course, and occasionally it's going to happen, I notice about this room, we have a vending machine right here, and the vending machine can sometimes take away from the ambiance. So something that I will note is if one of you ends up, and it doesn't need to be a particular one of you, but it'll be sort of a casual thing I notice. If one of you ends up closing that door mostly, and again, I crack it because it can get hot in here, and I don't want you to feel trapped, and I don't want people to feel like they're not allowed in. But if one of you ends up taking that up, it'll be something I notice that I consider sort of a fine behavior, a very pro-social behavior, though I don't expect it of anybody, and I'm not asking anyone to do it. Remember, Prelude paper due in under a month. You're going to have your prompts by Friday. You're welcome to start talking to me about that today, if you want to. If you want to send me an email, I'll tell you one thing. It's funny how one becomes an exemplar as a student. I had a student, computer scientist. He sat right where you're sitting, and he kind of looked at me like this. It wasn't exactly a defiant look. It was more like a, you gonna say something interesting to me today, Prof? Nah. And usually the answer was yes. But he, second day of class, came up to me with a prompt that he wanted to write on for his midterm essay. And so if you are thinking ahead, which I highly encourage you to think ahead, do not take the structure of the semester and how you are supposed to feel during the course of the semester from other voices. One thing I'll tell you is that the vast majority of people, including me at times, will say you're going to be very tired at the end of the semester. You're going to have just had Thanksgiving break. You're going to really be trying to personally will the semester to end. Unfortunately, you're going to have several final exams and final essays and final projects that are still due. Well, one way to get through that is to set yourself up to work all the way through the semester, not just to the end of the semester. No, and also work during the course of the semester in such a way that you don't just have a giant bit of work to do at the end of the semester that you're unprepared to do because you haven't developed the endurance necessary to work the long hours that are ahead of you to get a long-term project done in several consecutive hours, perhaps over nighttime hours that you're generally not up during. These are things you should think about. If you're the sort of person that knows you're going to be pulling all-nighters, you should be training to be good at doing all-nighters. For example, my wife, when she works 24-hour-long shifts, she has to be capable of using them. She has to be capable of delivering a child, perhaps even doing a cesarean section within 15 minutes of waking up in the middle of the night. She can do that because she's trained to do that. She doesn't do that just because she wants to do that. So these are the sorts of things that I would encourage you to think about. Most of you, I think, are probably just saying, I don't care. I'm going to do this like how everybody else does it. But then know that you're going to have results and experiences very similar to everybody else who does things in the same way. Though I think you'll also find that those words are a little bit light in that who is everybody else? What is the same way? Is everybody really doing everything in the same way, especially in a place with like 40, 50,000 people like LSU? Hard to say. I don't know. What do you think? Yeah, I don't know either. Okay, make sure that you review the schedule. There might be errors in the schedule. What you will have noticed going through syllabus day with many of your professors is that all syllabi are vestigial. What do I mean by vestigial? I mean that they've all been used before and that they've been adapted for the current circumstances. Maybe a new text has been added, a new date, but because of that, there are dates from old days, days past that may have trickled into here due to lack of appropriate copy editing. I should say there are probably very few in here, but it is possible that you will find one. And so if you do, please bring it up to me and let me know. I'll be proud of you for reading so closely. I won't be annoyed at you for finding some flaw in my game. I appreciate finding flaws in my game and errors in the things that I say, not because I like to communicate errors, but because I like to correct them. Okay, is there anything that I didn't say last time that's important? These are your required texts. Again, I would buy the physical copy, but you are very much well within your right to buy a digital copy, to somehow procure a digital copy, or to even listen to an Audible copy. I think with Don Quixote, there is an Audible that has the exact translation. This is something that you should pay attention to. Every book in this class, except for James Joyce's Ulysses, and except for Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway is translated. Now, some of these texts are quite old. Don Quixote is about 400 years old. The thing about translations of works that are old is there are often lots of them, lots and lots of them. But the ones that become open source and are easy to access for free on the internet are often really old translations. You all know how our language works. Do you speak like Shakespeare or somebody in the King James Bible? Have you used mine and thine and thou and thee lately outside of a joke? Probably not. So a lot of translations of these texts, particularly Don Quixote, Faust, this from Underground's a little bit better. They're dated. So Magic Mountain too. Makes it a lot harder to read a piece of literature if the language it's translated into is also foreign to you and difficult to understand. One example I'll give you is, have any of you ever read Homer's or parts of Homer's Iliad or Odyssey? I won't grill you on this. So there are texts. I'll grill you at some point. Okay. Did any of you read a translation that was translated into rhyming poetry? Homer doesn't rhyme, by the way. He's a poet, but he didn't rhyme. Alexander Pope, 17th century translator, translated Homer into rhyming couplets. Rhyming couplets. So like, I got the cup. This is not an actual line of Homer, by the way, much more magisterial. And then I bought the pup. I went to the goal, and then I bought the bowl. Over and over and over for 15,000 lines. Can you imagine trying to read that sort of thing? You would put after what? A lot, like a page or two? Don't do that to yourself. The translations that I've chosen here are for ease of reading. So if you have not yet acquired the book, or you have acquired a book which has a different translation, beware. Edith Grossman's is eminently readable. And that's why I got it for you. Same thing with this Faust, a tragedy. It's pretty good, though I will say that this is actually a very long poem. There are parts in verse, parts in prose. We'll talk a little bit about that. It won't be as obvious because we're not reading it in its original German. The Dostoevsky translation is a very good one. Ulysses is untranslated in English, but is so difficult to read, it doesn't need to be translated. In fact, something I often wonder, because I have a French translation of Ulysses, that's how could anybody ever read this in a different language? Native English speakers don't read this well. And I'll say one thing just to give you a collective groan, which is this. Not even my student who sat right there enjoyed Ulysses last semester. It is a monster. It is a monster that you must tame and that must be within you if you wish to be truly literate. But it is not the sort of book that almost anybody enjoys the first time through. And in fact, I've had a couple students say that it starts to drive them a little bit crazy because they get in their own heads and they start to think in a way like characters in Ulysses. That will make sense to you when we get to it. It is a stream of consciousness novel. So there's a lot of being in one's own head. All right. Professor,
yes. For Don Quixote,
yes.
You talked about the language that was used in it. It was a there's, like, are you talking about specifically like the narrator, like for like the audio, like say like the narrator using like die and thou? Because when I was listening to it, there was a few examples. But it was what Don Quixote read.
Okay.
Is that what you're talking about?
That's very interesting. I think you must have a different translation because even in the Grossman, and yes, there is a narrator, there's a Don Quixote, there's a Cid Hameti Benengeli, an Arabic commentator from whom the story supposedly came. He was, of course, fictional, as the fiction of the text. In the Grossman translation, none of that should be thine and thy and thou. And
No,
such.
no. Okay.
No.
Okay.
No. Though that would be sort of interesting. That's a very clever question. So like if you were reading a modern novelist, like say a 20th century work like the Dante Club, and characters within the text were reading, say, a manuscript of Dante that they found, would that then be an older language? The better literature it were, the more likely that would be the case. Good literature, great literature has more in it. And we can talk about more of what that is. All right. Before I put this to bed for today, any more questions about what we've gone over, the syllabus, any of that? This is the time. This is the time. Your questions do help people. They even help me. Sometimes I realize I have not said something very important. Yes?
The first essay, so it's going to be about the book.
Well, we'll talk about this more after I give you the prompts on Friday. But yes, your prompts will reflect the course material up to then. The course material up to then will be Don Quixote. So insofar as you stay in this course, your first essay will be on Don Quixote. So if you hate Don Quixote, then your action plan has just altered. That said, I wouldn't say, how do I say? Many students love Don Quixote, not at first. Like with professors, like with so many things. Perhaps just tell me through a glance. When somebody claims that a person or a text is great, does that create in you the expectation that, I don't know, probably not. I doubt it. Maybe not. Don Quixote is the sort of text that in the first part, I imagine you're going to be kind of like, what is this even about? Like, I know what it's about. It's not hard to tell, but I just don't resonate with it. It's in the second part, because there are two parts to this text, and we'll talk a lot about that on Friday and Monday in the time to come, that it really becomes something great. And there's a real shift. All of a sudden, it's as if you think you've been looking at a door, but in fact, you realize you've been looking at a prism through which you see a door. And so you think you see what's there, and then you realize that there's much more there than that which you originally saw. And perhaps it's even being added as the author continues to write. Perhaps he himself improves as a writer, and in improving as a writer improves the entire work itself. But these are prophecies at these points rather than descriptions. All right, let's talk about what we were going to talk about today. And this is a good time to take out whatever notepad that you are using, whatever pen or pencil. And again, feel free to shoot your arm up if I'm in the middle of talking about something. If I can't address your point, if I'm really on a roll, I'll ask you to give me a second. But most of the time, I'll stop and address what it is that you're asking. Okay. Something I didn't have a lot of time to do in my last iteration of this course was to talk about the meaning of the course. Possibly something that attracted you to this course, if you signed up for it yourself, was its name. Got a nice bit of alliteration going on here. Modernism, metempsychosis, that's the word that you probably really like telling people. And it is metempsychosis. Anybody have some excellent pronunciations of that you're willing to share? I'll explain what it means soon enough. And masterpieces. Why is this course called by these three terms? Just to attract young undergraduates impressed by interesting sounding words like moths are to a flame? Or is there some meaning underlining these words? And something I'll tell you, even if you're a senior, a junior, a sophomore, about a salute to you. Gesundheit. I guess salute is important because we're actually studying a Spanish text at this moment. Did any of you read Spanish, by the way? Anybody? It's so funny. If this were Southern California, so many people, but we're in French country right here. And so I know we have a French speaker, so we actually have a little bit of French today, and perhaps I'll have you translate. It's very easy to translate French, so it won't really showcase your abilities, but in any case. Okay, so what is modernity? I think in some ways, almost everybody thinks that they know what this means. Modern, from modus in Latin, meaning way or of the time. I had to change this because of the heat. I had to change my coat last time, so I don't have a marker, which I love, except, am I prepared from something? Ooh. You gotta be prepared to be unprepared. So modern comes from Latin word modus, sort of like, I don't know if you've ever seen like a la mode in French, that means in the style of. Modus, modern, means, it really means mode, style, manner. So what is the manner and style of modernism? Well, I'll tell you one thing, it's different from being contemporary. To be modern doesn't mean to be new. To be a contemporary, and this is how we speak in intellectual circles now, we are in the contemporary time. We don't necessarily have a time for the time in which we exist yet. Those are usually retroactively given to a time. For example, an example of this is that the Middle Ages, in the Middle Ages, people didn't know they were in the Middle Ages. And there's a famous quote of a guy saying, "These god dang Middle Ages, I can't wait for them to end." And it's like, right, nobody has that sort of perspicuity in the moment. Since time moves as it moves, one only knows one's in the middle after quite a bit of time has passed, right? Perhaps this will be the same in your own lives as you approach middle age. In any case, the definition, the operant definition of modernity that we use in this class largely comes from this slide and the one that comes after. That's a little bit of Picasso that I just flared across the screen. Very much a modernist artist. Peter Viereck says that modernism is defined as being the revolt against the revolt. I want you to really think about that for the entirety of the semester, the entirety of the day. What does it mean to revolt against a revolt? Is there any content to this ideology, for example? What are the actual beliefs of modernism? Or is modernism itself sort of like a pugilistic what's the word that I'm looking for? A combative, not combative, but it's close though, sort of a pugilistic combative ideology, an ideology that is meant not necessarily to create, but to destroy, or even to create through destruction, to change that which is established and traditional, to create room for something new, is something like what modernism is. So can there be modernist tendencies today? Yes. Can there be modernist tendencies 200 years ago? Obviously, we're starting 400 years ago. Can there be modernist tendencies 1,000 years ago? Yes. What is the modernist tendency? And why do I find that valuable for you? Well, you're new people. Ostensibly, there are some things about the world that you've learned that you wish to change, or you wish to make some contribution to. Perhaps you wish to make people healthier, cure cancer, write a great novel, make a bunch of money and just have a good life, and not be somebody else's problem. Perhaps these are good things. Modernism is a philosophy by which one creates something new by changing something traditional or older, regardless of where or what time one exists. And so true modernism, true literary modernism, we have three texts that come from this tradition. It's from the 1920s, and it features often expatriate writers not writing in their countries of origin. For example, James Joyce, who wrote in France for some amount of time, though he wrote about Ireland. Thomas Mann, because of his resistance to the Nazis and his public speaking against them, spent time in my native California writing. And Virginia Woolf, I don't think actually spent that much time outside of where she was from, but she is also a modernist author from the 1920s. Why do I include other texts as works of modernism, though they're from substantially earlier than the 1920s, like Don Quixote? Well, something I'll say about Don Quixote, which I think you will start to realize very quickly upon reading it, is that it features a very modern, even contemporary character, a character who does not care for the identity that he is given by his society, and wishes to completely change it, and does completely change it. Unfortunately, his society is not quite ready for his changes. And there's a strong interplay between what the people who meet him think he is, and in fact, a tremendous conflict, and what he acts like and what he himself thinks he is. And so something that is featured in Don Quixote that I consider eminently modern is the conflict between one's self-fashioning and the fashioning of one's society. And something that comes out that makes this book sophisticated is fashioning is an interactive process. It's not just society that is right or that can make somebody into a Don Quixote-like figure, but also one runs into tremendous resistance from one society if one tries to fashion an identity totally different from anything anybody has ever seen before. For example, Don Quixote will act like a knight from fiction that has never existed in reality. And so everybody around him, like when rock and roll and jazz first came around, will be blown away and not really know what to do. And that is something that I think that is one of the many attributes of this text that I think makes it truly modern. Let's get into some more definitions. Matthew Arnold. He says modernism is an intellectual deliverance in the pursuit is the peculiar, demand of those ages which are called modern, an intellectual deliverance. Again, this has the language of transforming from one tradition to another, of giving one the tools to see through traditional forms of experiencing reality in order to experience something new and to alter either the literature one writes in or the society in which one exists. I don't want to read this entire thing here, but okay, yes, let's go all the way down to modernity. They argued does not necessarily mean the very latest thing. Rather, it is a program of cultural emancipation, a principle of life itself. What does that mean? Given what I've said about the nature of modernity, what do you think this means when it says that modernity is a principle of life itself? What is something that you think is true about life? Yes. Life is ever changing. You know what's interesting about this is that this doesn't say that life is ever evolving point to point. It says that it's ever changing. The suggestion being that when will life ever remain the same? Never. And so who do you think affects change? The people that understand the mechanisms of change or the people who don't? Perhaps you can affect unconscious change. Sure, for sure. I can accidentally light my house on fire by keeping a candle lit that smells like delicious cinnamon, trying to bring fall into the air by smelling cinnamon. It hasn't worked so far, but you know, what is it that are any of you into yoga? Do you know the great text or the great term of American yoga is to manifest something, and so I try to manifest through putting cinnamon. In any case, principle of life itself, change seems to be the principle of life itself. And so something about modernism is supposed to be eminently natural. It's really interesting because when I check out some of the art from modernism, it doesn't look that natural, right? I mean, look at these colors. These are unnaturally bright, vivid colors, unless you look at, I can't really say that. There are some extremely bright and beautiful creatures, particularly birds and apes too, and funny parts of them too. I'm not necessarily saying to go look up that sort of thing up, but you can find very funny parts of these creatures really well colored because they care about that, or at least evolutionarily they care about that sort of thing. But yeah, so maybe it was this. So remember, okay, good question. Remember, and this is something I should say, in the 20th century, the very famous Museum of Modern Art in New York City changed to the Museum of Contemporary Art. So when we're talking about new now, we use the word contemporary. But when was this contemporary and new? The 1920s.
I was under the impression that modern art was like all those squares that seem like anyone could make it.
There, oh yeah, and Jackson Pollock is one of those representatives. We'll talk a lot about what modernism is, and Picasso also did delve into cubism quite a bit too, and perspectivism. This is a bit of perspectivism. Note that it looks like a person looking from the side, but you can see two of the person's eyes. This suggests a different perspective on the individual. In fact, something out here, any of you want to have something interesting to argue with people about concerning art? Here's something that makes good art different from bad art. How many of you are very unaccomplished artists like I am and you draw two-dimensional people looking for like this? Such a piece of art lacks perspective. Does anybody actually look like this? No, if you're drawing a face, you like draw a person's face, you know, just their face. Here, let me see if I can get this here. So like you like start like this, right? You have to get my funny hair here, my ear, things like, you have to start by thinking about what would this person look like from this perspective. And that is a criterion for really good art. You can see this master artist, and Picasso has many, many, many amazing sketches. And actually a funny question about, a funny response to your question is that a woman once asked him for a piece of art, and this may be apocryphal, and he made a little drawing on a napkin and handed it to her. And she said, "But why should I pay you for that? You just made it in like 2 minutes." And he said, "I spent my entire life preparing to make that," which I really like. In any case, there's also a piece of apocryphal story that he spent his entire life learning to paint like this. Though I will say he is a master of a classical form. I think some current contemporary young modern or art critics really get upset at art that claims to be art that does not show off the technical prowess of the artist in an immediate fashion, right? You watch it, you look at Renaissance art of Raphael or Michelangelo, the level of detail. You can see like the veins sticking out of the arm. It's amazing, the level of realism. There's a different standard when it comes to modernism. It doesn't mean that it isn't also skillful, though I will say that it is good for you to question contemporary art, because sometimes art can be a little, can certainly be experimental, and certain experiments fail, certain experiments succeed. Here's another piece by Picasso here. One thing I would just encourage you to think when you look at art and it's non-realistic is, what is it trying to say? And your first answer, if you're being honest, is, I don't know. But think about it, look at it. That's another thing. A lot of people look at it for a second, and then they look away. Let your eyes pass over. As you look at something, you will learn about it. This is a weird thing to say to you, but when I learn a language, particularly Greek and Latin, those are the languages I know best, besides English. Something I was taught is just look at the page, look at the words for a while. Start to see how they look. Start to see how sentences look. Start to see how paragraphs look. Eventually, when you are looking at something, ideas will pop into your head. Even, I mean, you know, you might have an idea like, I'm bored, I don't want to do this. But like, you'll be like, why is he using green? All of a sudden, that's a really great question. Why is there green and red? Why is there green and red and blue? Why is her hair differing colors on differing sides? But then if you really start to think about that, might you find an answer lurking in your mind? Why might somebody represents a lady as having her hair different colors on different sides? That's her hair. Yeah, yeah. It might not be. But I mean, do you remember that sort of vision game a couple years back? Is this a blue or black dress, or is this a golden white dress? And the issue was what? It was lighting, it was perspective. Lighting can be different on different parts of you. And in fact, are any of you models? Anybody who's a model knows that you're always being put under, or any of you actors? Ooh, you're put under incredible light, such light. You know how I'm sweating when I come in here? Lighting that makes you sweat like that. In fact, if you've ever seen the Pulp Fiction scene where they're in a coffee, where they're in a hot coffee house, the lighting was so hot there that everybody was sweating intensely. In any case, the lighting creates an illusion that makes you look better than you actually do. Perhaps you have one mirror in your house or in the gym where you're like, man, I look really great in this. It's like, well, that is an issue of perspective and light. And so I'm not saying that that will answer everything about this, this painting that perhaps looks a little bit bizarre to you, but these are the sorts of questions that we're going to start to ask. For example, Whose perspective is legitimate in Don Quixote's case? Is his perspective that he is a chivalric knight from works of fantasy literature correct? Or is it the perspective of those around him, the cook and the priest and the hotelier that he'll meet, who suggest that he is a crazy man? Whose perspective is legitimate? And in our time, I would say that this is a very important question because who is it that you trust? Do you trust the media, this person in the media? Do you watch YouTube videos? Do you read books? Who is the authority? And where does the truth exist? Well, that's a question that you're going to have to figure out for yourself. And that's a question that in this course, we will attempt to give you the tools necessary to investigate. I'm not going to say that you'll find it, but like any archaeologist, I will teach you how to use a shovel. But that's about as much as I can offer, I think. Whether you uncover magical bones or not is up to you. All right, what is modernism in the last couple minutes? I've only talked about modernism. I've got two other terms to talk about. That's how things go. All right, modernism. These are some good factoids to know, or rather, I'll call them facts. It is a rejection of form in visual art and classical forms in literature. We'll talk a lot about this, but there were a couple of philosophers, particularly Aristotle and Horace, who wrote manuals on how art was to be performed, on how drama was to be performed. For example, Aristotle said that all drama, all works of literature should take place in one place over the span of 24 hours. And so anything that takes place over a month, over a year, that changes locations is going to fail his criteria. This text takes place over quite a bit of time, and Don Quixote is constantly traveling around. So it will eschew classical forms. Cervantes, the name of our wonderful author, that's last name, but though we will talk a little bit about names and Spanish names. You may find when you look at your copy of Don Quixote that Cervantes is not the only name that you see on there. Let's see, no, I've just got Miguel de Cervantes. Sometimes people have the last bit of his name, de la Saavedra. Any of you have that one? That has to do with naming conventions in Spanish, where both one's patrilineal and one's matrilineal descent are included. In any case, Cervantes makes fun of including learned Latin phrases at the beginning of the book. This is something when you read the introduction, make sure that you do read the introduction. You will include many learned references and vouchers from even fictional characters who obviously could not have read his book because they are fictional characters. He will even have a prognostication from his horse named Rosinante. And if you think, that's pretty funny, right? He's claiming that these learned people have read his book and are giving him sort of blurbs to suggest how good his writing is, and he includes his horse. That'd be like you including your hat, your cat, or your gerbil. They might like you, but they probably don't have a strong opinion of your literary output. In any case, Cervantes makes fun of the genre of chivalric romance. I'll talk a lot about that soon. This is something important about modernism. Modernism is realist in nature. Realist in nature means that it's a little bit less imaginative than what you think of when you think of ancient and medieval literature. Ancient literature, Homer, Virgil, the gods are present. Zeus is anthropomorphized, Jove, Jupiter. The gods are parts of the narrative. They have active roles in the drama. They bring things about it. Have any of you read the Aeneid? The Aeneid's a little bit rare Latin text. It begins with the ire of Juno, who is the Hera character there. And so in ancient and medieval texts, gods are very present. Spirits are very present. Something in this text is that it is going to make fun of those things. God will be mentioned because this is a text written by a Catholic individual just after the Protestant Reformation, right at the beginning of the 17th century. But there will be no characters who are gods. There will be no characters who even clearly know magic, though magic will be mentioned often. And objects, everyday objects will be included. And this will perhaps just seem normal to us because we're used to a level of realism when we watch movies and read books and watch TV. But everyday objects like shaving basins will be included. Traditionally in medieval literature, chivalric literature, the only objects you find are shields, swords. Do any of you play RPG games? Or like online RPGs? The sorts of things you would find in those places. Golden chests, guarded by dragons, enchanters, special objects of special magical importance. If you've ever read Beowulf, Beowulf is a very good example of that. He acquires a couple of very special swords during the course of the text, but basically nothing else. But you're going to get things like shaving basins in this text. And that is a very modern sort of thing. All right. All right. Metempsychosis. I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker, but I highly encourage you to read these two quotes. Plato, a 4th century Greek philosopher, student of Socrates, and himself the teacher of Aristotle, who was the teacher of Alexander the Great. In fact, so good a teacher was he that Alexander the Great on campaign, when he ran across a new animal, would supposedly send that animal to Aristotle, who is known as being a great zoologist. In any case, Plato's book 10, The Myth of Er, as well as Virgil's Aeneid, book 6, have very interesting accounts. If you're interested in ideas like the soul, God, and resurrection, and your soul going through life, and then going through an underworld, and then coming back and going through another life in sort of a Hindu, sort of Buddhist way, you should definitely read these two quotes. They're a little bit long for me to read, but they both have to do with that idea. And in fact, that is what the idea of metempsychosis is that a soul can be in a body, the body can dissolve, soul will continue on in some form or another, and then will be reanimated, revivified at some point. What does that mean in the context of this course? This isn't like a theology course. The idea seems to be something like that the truth remanifests itself, but in different form every single generation. And so metempsychosis is allegorically the process by which truth transforms its outer trappings. And so if you wish to be a hunter of truth, you must learn the forms that it takes. And something that I claim that this course can do for you, if you get the full dose, as it were, is it can teach you to see something consistent and essential moving through the world, through space and time. Those trappings, those differences that people get hung up on, keep them from seeing certain truths, certain causal webs disappear when one truly understands the workings of metempsychosis in literature and what cultural values and truths also are transformed and transmitted through literature. That is my sort of poetical way of putting this. But do make sure you read it. I mean, just to give you a little bit, I'm just going to read a little bit at the end here. All these that you see, this from the 1st century BCE, when they have rolled time's wheel through 1,000 years, the God summons in vast throng to Lethe's river. Have you ever heard of Lethe's river? It comes from the Greek word Latin phano, which means to forget. It's the river of forgetfulness. In Dante's Purgatorio, as well as in Virgil's Aeneid, a soul, in order to be reborn, must bathe second baptism in Lethe, forget all of one's memories, all of one's bad memories, in the case of Dante, and then be reborn. This is part of the idea of being reborn through both water and fire, which we can talk about at some point. That's a little bit different. In any case, the god summons and vast throng to Lethe's river so that their memories efface and may once more revisit the vault above, see the desire of return to the body. Interesting. All right. When I talk about the third part of this class, so modernism, metempsychosis, and masterpieces. Masterpiece is a categorical, is a way of categorizing that is contrasted with the classic and with the piece of world literature. A piece of world literature is fairly basic. A work enters into world literature by a double process. This is written by David Damrosch, a Harvard professor who's at the top of the comparative literature field. By being read as literature. That's important. So just reading a menu in a different language doesn't make it into world literature. Second, by circulating out into the broader world beyond its linguistic and cultural point of origin, you can understand that there is an economic element to the world literature. The work needs to be published and translated and then sold to people, which is much easier now than it has ever been in the past. But we are not just looking at world literature. Classics. Many people that you talk to about the text in this class will be like, that's a classic. And classic, in fact, does mean the highest iteration of something. So Coca-Cola Classic is the most Coca-Cola. So classical Arabic, classical Latin, classical Greek are the highest iterations, the most sophisticated versions of the languages. And so classics is actually a field of study at the university where we have classicists here, by the way. Did any of you know that? And they study Greek and Roman literature. So the true definition of a classic, though you may have heard of a Barnes and Noble classic, a Bantam classic, a modern library classic, is a text from the 8th through the 1st century BCE, written in Greek or Latin. So masterpieces, the third category, can be classics. They can also be pieces of world literature, but the category itself is a little bit less exclusive. Texts do not need to come from a particular nation. They do not need to be written in a particular language. They do not need to come from a particular time period. Classics, certain time period, certain area around the Mediterranean, classic. What about all the other good works? How are we supposed to describe that? Well, the masterpiece, on the other hand, can be an ancient work, a modern work. It need not have had any foundational cultural force. Epic literature, epics like the Aeneid, the Iliad and Odyssey, Paradise Lost for English, often are considered as having cultural force because they synthesize the language that will then be used by a political entity. Homer, in some ways, created the Greek that the Athenians used. Virgil took Latin and turned it into a literary language. Dante took Italian and turned it into a literary language. And Milton did the same with English, competing against, just like Dante, Latin at the time. You can see how languages that are vulgar or considered sort of low, used by the young and people out in the sticks, can then be used to write literature and then are elevated in their use to the point where Latin goes from being just a vulgar tongue that people who would prefer to speak Greek use to all of a sudden be the tongue that's used to express the liturgy of the Bible, for example. In fact, not even 100 years ago, Vatican II was when Catholic liturgies were decided it was decided that they could be performed in the vernacular, in the vulgar languages, rather than just in Latin, which was their holy language, which was the Catholic holy language until whenever Vatican II was, between the 1930s and 1950s. I'm forgetting my exact date. In any case. So, okay, let me say these things, and these will be the last things that I say. It was one of the authors from our course, Goethe, who came up with the notion of masterpiece, the notion of world literature, and started working towards masterpiece. He himself was very interested in these Chinese tales that I had not myself read, but he was very cosmopolitan. He did not simply want to put forward a German literature, but was interested in literature, capital L, and what could be achieved by authors if they were to be influenced by each other and not just their single national tradition, which you can tell is part of the ethos that you have been taught in your literary courses during the course of your life if you've grown up in America. Probably you have not just read American literature, but the tremendous efforts have been made by your professors and teachers to teach you something far more representative of what exists in the world, which means that you've probably read a lot of work in translation, and you should really think about how much work goes into creating a new edition of a work, translating it, and then selling it to a different culture that speaks a different language. It's not something that just happens naturally. Okay, a masterpiece is a work of literature that transcends space and time by means of impact of its narrative. It's truly masterful. A masterpiece conveys at least one message of universal importance. We'll talk about. Do you have any idea? What's a message of universal importance? Yes. Slow and steady wins the race. Okay. So something like measure twice, cut once, or taking a shortcut is the surest way to waste time, or something like that. And we have many idioms that mean the same thing. We have ones that speak against each other too. Like you all know that what is it? Out of sight, out of mind, right? But absence makes the heart grow fonder. So you can't trust your cliches in your culture. Because, well, it depends on the circumstance, right? You need to be able to apply these things correctly. The adverb of something is very important, not just the adjective and the noun. How something is done. If I say fine, I'm saying something very different to you than fine, right? You can hear that. You know that that's different. I'm like, that's fine. I've said something yet different. Yes, there's a question.
But also like the loss of half a say, you know, like curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. The loss of half the meaning changes it.
You know, that's funny that you say that because what's often quoted to me, people try and get one over on professors all the time. Because anybody that lives by their skill, people are always trying to see whether they have the skill that they claim to have. And so if you're a swordsman, you better be willing to show your skill with the sword. And so people say, don't you know that Aristotle quote that says those who can do, those who can't teach? I say, actually, I do know the Aristotle quote. The Aristotle quote says, those who can do, those who understand teach.
Yeah, meaning half.
But that's why you have to learn so that you care, can bring it back. Like I just did. So now you know something real rather than something you can just look at on the internet that's false, that fills your head with. Well, that which has the adjective that applies to the noun of a vacuous, empty. A masterpiece appeals across geopolitical, linguistic, religious, and temporal boundaries. Those are all sophisticated words, but really think about them. That means geography, language, religion, and time do not matter to a masterpiece. It can be, in some ways, made of anything. A masterpiece remains a masterpiece in translation. That's very important for us. Some of you will say that the Goethe piece that we read does not maintain itself. And a masterpiece need not achieve the linguistic and political aims of an epic. It doesn't need to found a new civilization. So these are the few things that I want to stop with. I think I ran just up on time. Class is dismissed. I look forward to seeing many of you on Friday. Are any of you traveling to Las Vegas? Yeah, we have an FTC football game and USC. Yeah, no. And so I would understand.